All right, so today we are talking about spatial demography of head injury incidents and crashed motor vehicle type in Illinois. I am Dr. Mickey Edwards, lead transportation researcher at the Center for State Policy and Leadership at the University of Illinois at Springfield. So here's a question. Are you safer in a bigger vehicle, like a pickup truck, SUV, or a van, than you are in a traditional passenger car? Well, the answer may surprise you. It's complicated. More specifically, it really just kind of depends. There are many different types of vehicle crashes, like a car versus a truck versus a fixed object, like a post, or a truck versus a truck, and so on. So since crash types are pretty unpredictable, and we often make vehicle purchase decisions based on our perceived safety of a vehicle type, today in this analysis, we pool all crash types together along with all drivers and passengers for a general study of the prevailing safety trends of various vehicle types. Okay, so this study uses linked hospital and crash data for the years 2016 through 2022. And since these are linked data, we're probably missing some of the crashes because we can't link them all. But rest assured, the proportions that we will share with you are correct. So this means is we were able to link 420,169 crashes. Of those, 69% are passenger cars, 19% are SUVs, 6.2% are pickup trucks, and 5.9, almost 6% are vans or minivans. And starting off looking at all levels of injuries sustained in a crash across all occupants and all vehicle types, we get a matrix that looks pretty much like the one we see here. Passenger cars make up 69% of linked crashes, as we established, but just 61.7% of fatal crashes. So they're underrepresented in fatal crashes. And we would expect to see these proportions to be about the same if all vehicle types were equally safe. Pickup truck occupants were twice as likely to be killed in a crash compared to occupants of passenger cars, at 0.6 and 0.3% of linked crashes, respectively. And SUV occupants were the second most likely to be killed at 0.5% of those crashes, followed by vans and minivans at 0.4% of linked crashes, and finally by passenger cars. And the potential for lifelong negative consequences resulting from a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, is pretty well understood. So here we examine the relationship between vehicle type and its occupant sustaining a moderate or worse head injury when in a crash, one that could be considered a TBI. And here we see the occupants of pickup trucks were the most likely to receive a potential TBI, with 3.7% of linked crashes resulting in one. And occupants of vans and minivans were the least likely to sustain a potential TBI at 2.3% of crashes. So with these linked data, another interesting and unique thing that we can do with these is to look at how crash victims may be affected financially by examining hospital charges associated with treatment for their injuries. And here we see the average and median distribution of hospital charges by the occupants of crashed vehicle types. And perhaps not surprising, given the previous matrices showing more severe injury, pickup truck occupants received the highest charges on average and the median charges compared to occupants of other vehicles. Passenger cars are second, and that's probably because of a higher standard deviation. SUV occupants are third, and vans and minivans are the lowest. So we were also curious if there was any connection between race and crashed vehicle type, since there could be implications for injury outcomes. And one thing that stands out immediately while looking at this is that males make up just 44% of crash victims, but 73% of crashed pickup truck occupants. And the white road users are just 49.2% of linked crash occupants. There's 73.9% of crashed pickup truck occupants, while black road users are slightly overrepresented as passenger car occupants by about 4 percentage points. So now, returning to the topic we opened up with, teenage drivers and safe vehicles. So are teenage drivers really safer in big vehicles, big heavy vehicles? Well, we really could not find any evidence to support this assertion. And here we see in this table, we see that teenage drivers are actually more likely than non-teenage drivers to sustain a moderate or worse head injury, a potential TBI, no matter what type of vehicle they occupy. Teenage drivers of crashed pickup trucks were 2 percentage points more likely to sustain a potential TBI like this at 5.4% of linked crashes, the most of any type. All other teenage occupants were also more likely to sustain a moderate or worse head injury in a pickup truck. So the likelihood of sustaining a potential TBI injury remains about the same across the other three vehicle types, further suggesting that SUVs really do not provide much protection for teens. So in fact, the opposite may actually be true. Teenage drivers and passengers may actually be at greater risk in a large vehicle like a pickup truck. So we see here that generally potential TBIs occur at an elevated rate in a rural built environment at about 30.3% of cases. And here we see that pickup trucks are highly overrepresented in crashed vehicle types in a rural setting at 39.6% of all crashed pickup trucks. But when we graph the poverty rate versus the carless household rate of the 100 zip codes with the most TBIs sustained in a crash, the majority of those injuries occur in poor neighborhoods with diminished access to a vehicle. The top 6 zip codes with the highest rates are all bordering neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. Numbers 7 and 8 are neighborhoods in central Springfield. So while urban areas certainly have concentrations of potential TBIs, those in rural areas also have an elevated risk overall. Well, so what can we do about this? Well, we need a better understanding of what is causing those in disadvantaged and disproportionately affected neighborhoods to sustain head injuries at such a high rate. Males, especially white males, are highly overrepresented in moderate or worse head injury outcomes as occupants of pickup trucks. And despite common beliefs, this investigation was unable to show that teenagers were safer in large vehicles. In fact, evidence presented here may point in the opposite direction. So maybe something like additional training and certification requirements for teenage drivers to operate a pickup truck may be helpful in preventing them from sustaining severe head injuries. Finally, this study does not distinguish between unibody SUVs and the rigid truck-based body-on-frame type of SUV. Given similar manufacturing platforms, occupants of truck-based SUVs likely have similar crash outcomes as those in standard pickup trucks. That is, worse outcomes relative to other vehicle types. Occupants of vehicles struck by truck-based SUVs also likely face similar outcomes as those struck by standard pickup trucks. That is, worse outcomes relative to being struck by other vehicle types. The study also does not distinguish between various crash scenarios or size and heft mismatches in colliding vehicles. Future studies should control for variations in SUV frame manufacturing to better understand differences in crash outcomes across the growing and increasingly diverse SUV fleet. Successive studies should also go more in depth into why occupants of pickup trucks suffer more injurious outcomes relative to occupants of other vehicle types. These worse outcomes may be a result of the physics of pickup trucks, or they may be attributable to characteristics of the typical driver of this vehicle type.